But on behalf of the International Food Policy Research Institute, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the IFPRI seminar series. This is our 6th seminar of 2018. It is part of the EIVS USAID funded project, which supports the objectives of the USAID Agribusiness for Rural Development and Incomes project. And following our usual spirit of partnering with different institutions, it's a particular pleasure to be partnering today with World Fish on an exciting topic, leveraging aquaculture and fisheries for improving food and nutrition security in Egypt. It's also a great pleasure to have two ministries on board today, the Ministry of Supply and Internal Trade and represented from the Ministry of Agriculture. So this seminar will provide an overview of changing trends in fish production, supply, and consumption in Egypt, and discuss solutions to how to improve and scale up the sector. It's a diverse panel of speakers that will introduce findings and present recommendations about ongoing research on the country's main fish and aquaculture sectors related to sustainable production, environmental management, and pro-poor development. So, as I mentioned, we've got a diverse panel of speakers today to facilitate knowledge exchange. Let me give the floor first to the Director General of World Fish.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. My name is Gareth Johnston, the Director General of World Fish. Our headquarters in Malaysia, so we're based in a place called Penang. We have been operational can you hear me all right? It seems to be phasing out. Okay. Operational in Egypt with a relationship with the government, and we work since 1998, I believe. So almost over 20 years. Working on aquaculture. People might have been aware of the tilapia Abasa strain. We developed that with the government at the Abasa facility, which is a little bit outside of Cairo. Thank you so much also for allowing me to make a few comments before this seminar. I'm very, very supportive of collaborative events such as this, particularly World Fish and IFPRI working together with two CGIR centres, a consultative group for international agriculture research. So we both work together within that consortia, that group. And I'd also like to thank the organisers for inviting me. I think getting the right balance between the development of aquaculture and managing existing fisheries is critical to ensure livelihoods, food security, food and nutrition security are maintained, and it's critical to get that balance. We know that wild fisheries, particularly those accessible to the poor, provide the hidden backbone of welfare support to people without land, and provide essential animal source protein and vitamin A and iron, which are particularly deficient in women and children in sub-Saharan Africa. We refer to this as hidden harvest, so what the small-scale fisheries can provide. So I'm very pleased that this seminar is looking at both aquaculture and fisheries. And often that hidden harvest is not included in the national production data. So research, this discussion and the seminar series here plays a key role in helping government create the right policies and environment for economic growth, particularly of aquaculture, as we are kind of at the precipice of great growth of aquaculture across the continent, and Egypt is at the forefront of that. And also safeguarding and managing, well, its natural resources, and again, refer to that balance. Research is also important to the market. As we know, the market often fails to value many intangibles that fish provides, not only in terms of income, but its value in terms of nutrition. And we also know that reducing waste and loss of fish is important. 1 in every fish that is harvested is lost due to poor handling and processing. And so we need to look at ways of maintaining and adding value. So that's another economic area which our research can add value to the fish harvest. As DG, I'm very lucky because I can also take a step back and think big picture. As the DG, to be able to step back and take a bigger picture view And also our work in World Fish looks at future studies. We look at the future, and that helps governments and industry look at how they can develop the industry, particularly a sustainable industry. Some of our futures work has looked at the population growth in Africa. As we know, in the next 30 years, the population growth across the continent will double from 1.1 billion currently to 2.2 billion, so it will double in size. And so producing enough fish is going to be a massive challenge for all of us. Currently, the production levels of fish are not keeping a pace of population growth. So if I just can just highlight the global consumption of fish on average per person per year is 20 kilograms of fish per person per year. That's the global average. In Africa, and it is different between countries, and you'll hear during the seminars today how it was different in Egypt, but the average across the continent in Africa is 10 kilograms per person per year. And if you compare that to Asia, it's just under 40 kilograms per person per year. Now, however, despite Africa's having the lowest per capita fish consumption, fish provides almost 20% of the animal protein. So it's a really important component of people's diet. As I mentioned, it's nutrition, animal protein as well. If we think about what the current production level is in Africa, the current level is about 10.5 million tons, of which aquaculture produces about 1.8 million tons. So about 20% or less comes from aquaculture. The majority of that comes from capture fisheries, from our lakes, from our rivers, irrigation systems and dams. The future projections, if we double the population of Africa, will be that there's a need for almost 25 million tons of fish by 2030 to maintain the current consumption level of 10 kilograms per person per year. Capture fisheries will not necessarily increase rapidly in terms of production, so it will stabilise around 9 or 10 million tons per year for Africa's consumption. Aquaculture, therefore, will need to grow. And the projections, as a business per usual projection using these futures research, indicates that by 2050, aquaculture will produce about 3 million tons per year. And that means if you want to keep the current consumption rate of fish, we're going to have to import, or Africa has to import, about 13 million tons of fish. Now that has a problem because currently we're importing here in this continent 3 million tons, it depends on each country. And the tendency is to export high-value fish, marine fish, high-value fish, and import low-quality fish. So that's the tendency. And that trend will continue. So it's very important that the industry, we bring government, research and industry together and form policies to ensure that relationship. If you want to double the consumption in Africa to get too close to the global average of 20 kilograms per person with no imports, so it's fully self-sufficient, then aquaculture production has to reach heights of about 33 million tons per year, so a massive challenge. So to address this shortfall, and where there has been successes like in Egypt and like in Nigeria and Uganda and other countries that have been able to increase their production of aquaculture to meet the demand, this is where there's been coordination between public, private and research in a tripartite dialogue to be able to develop a sustainable industry. Now it's not just aquaculture, it's also improving management of capture fisheries and reducing fish loss and waste. So I think today's seminar will hopefully go some way to thinking through some of these big issues and raising our understanding of the many challenges to realising these goals and having enough fish for Africa. And I think Egypt is an important country in taking a lead and helping to guide other countries through a lot of the knowledge that you have here. So I wish you well in the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the background and thoughts about the really importance of aquaculture in Egypt and in Africa in general. I'd like to just briefly mention For our panel today, we have diverse representatives from both international research institutes, both WorldFish and researchers at IFPRI, as well as local researchers from the Agricultural Research Center. And we're also happy to have representatives of the public sector to share with us what's happening on the ground as far as policies in Egypt. So we'll be joined later by Deputy Minister of Agriculture, Ms. Mona Mehras. And as well, we have with us Engineer Al-Basel Al-Hassan, board member and head of the commercial sector at the Suez Canal Fish Farming and Aquaculture Company, Suez Canal Authority affiliated company. And he'll present some of the ongoing interventions and aquaculture mega projects in Egypt. And we also have Professor Dr. Ayman Al-Akrash, Deputy Ministry of Supply and Internal Trade and Project Affairs, and General Madhat Al-Asar, Chairman of the Egyptian Company for Fish Marketing, which is the company responsible for fisheries under the ministry. Both are present today to answer any questions that you may have, as well as take on some of the key messages and policy suggestions brought forward by the representatives of the research community. So we'll start with a presentation online from our colleague back in DC. The presentations will all be 10 minutes, so please stick to that as we have a lot of material to get through today. In general, we'll be keeping questions till the end, but for our first presenter, we'll have questions directly after his presentation. So,
yes, I am.
Okay.
Let me share my screen. Just 1 minute, please.
Okay, while you're getting set up, let me just introduce Siwo Misangi. He is an independent consultant in the area of agriculture and natural resources. Until June, he was a senior research fellow at IFPRI in the Environment and Production Technology Division under the research theme of natural resource management. Dr. Misangi's research focuses on the major socioeconomic and biophysical drivers affecting agricultural production systems and their impacts on nutrition, poverty, and the environment. He also has research interests in livestock and aquatic production systems and their interaction with the environment. And so today he'll be presenting the findings of his book, The Rise of Aquaculture, the Role of Fish in Global Food Security.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Good afternoon to you in Cairo. I'm glad to be able to join your presentation. Let me give you a quick overview of this work to 2030. Just to give you the context, it originated actually from a collaborative project funded by the World Bank, in which they were co-authors, senior co-authors, along with FAO, and with Madan Day, who was actually in WorldFish some years ago, is now based in, this is his old affiliation, he's actually at University of Texas Tech University at the moment. So this was collaborative work in which we tried to look at an overview of fish and as a forward-looking study. The WorldFish Center actually did parallel work on looking in depth at nutrition and at the consumption of low-value fish in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that actually it was the Egypt office that did that work, and so results from that work could be available from the IFPRI Egypt office, from the WorldFish Egypt office. The work that was done was actually building off of previous work, Fish to 2020, that was also done in collaboration with WorldFish as part of our 2020 Outlook study that IFPRI did in 2003. What this work tried to do is to try and take a new perspective, an updated, it was done actually about 10 years later, to take a closer look at aquaculture. We simplified capture to basically keep it exogenous, because it, as was just mentioned, it hasn't really grown very much. I'll show you some of that treatment, some of those results. To look at feed much more carefully, because, and I'll point out in terms of where the sources of feed for aquaculture are going to compete sometimes with the feed for animals, and the way in which you model technological efficiency in improvements in how fish are fed, it makes a big difference in terms of the results. And we also did want to make sure that we looked at that the other sector in more detail and treated it more carefully in the modeling than was done previously, and to provide a greater disaggregation of some of the production systems that are there. You can imagine fish is very different from livestock, excuse me, in the sense that there's thousands literally of species and you have to aggregate in some way, but we tried to disaggregate to give it a little bit more meaning. Well, one of the things we did when we were doing the study is to first of all look back and see how well we did the previous one. What was clear from looking at the data is that, well, the data that we, in 2010 as it existed, was already where the IFPRI 2020 projections for the 2003 study were pointing to. So there was an underestimation of aquaculture growth, and there was an overestimation of where the capture fisheries would be by 2020 in that previous study. So that was one of the reasons why we decided to basically keep capture at a very exogenous, relatively low rate of growth, practically no growth actually globally, and to spend much more time on aquaculture because that's where all the growth is. It's challenging, and as you can see from these projections, and as was just mentioned as well, all of the growth that you've seen over time has been coming from aquaculture. Incredibly dynamic, which makes it actually quite difficult to capture in some of the modeling work that we do. You can imagine, I mean, look at aquaculture where it is in terms of its rate of growth as a sector compared to other food sectors. It's actually been growing very fast, and that actually makes it one of the most dynamic contributors to the animal food production, source foods in many places. But the kind of dynamics of growth that you see is different from other sort of things. This is an example of tilapia, where you can have countries going from practically zero, let's say in 1992, to exporting, tens of thousands and many thousands of tons just a decade later. You don't see this kind of dynamics in a lot of agricultural sectors. I mean, maybe coffee at some point was similar to this, but that makes it a bit challenging in terms of how you capture it, because equilibrium models don't tend to deal with that kind of structural change very well. Nonetheless, we applied an equilibrium model, and I'll explain to you how that, briefly, I'll show you the link to the report. I would encourage you all to go and download the full report, which has all the details.
Siwa, sorry to cut in, but can you just let us know when you want to advance, because we're going through your presentation locally here, not actually on your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I was sharing my screen.
No, sorry.
Okay, so could you go to the slide that says market linkages then? Okay. In which case, maybe I'll...
Okay, we're at that slide right now.
Okay, so as you can see, there's we tried to capture both agriculture and the fishery sector at the same time. We're looking both at the connections between what's coming from agriculture in terms of feed from protein meals like soybean, which goes actually into some of the vegetative sort of fish like catfish. Consume a lot of soybean meal as opposed to fish meal, which is consumed by, let's say, salmon and other carnivorous types of fish. At the same time, you also have fish meal going into some of the livestock sectors, like poultry and pigs. And so there is that competition for feed that exists, and we tried to capture that. And not only did we try and capture the fish meal that's coming directly from the reduction of small varieties of fish like anchovies, but we also tried to look at the proportion of feed, which is quite considerable, about 20% of fish meal that comes actually from processing waste. After, let's say, fish are filleted, in the processing, what's left over in terms of what's left on the deck after the fish have been made into fillets and processed for consumer, that's also available as for reduction into fish meal. So we try to look at all the different sources of feed in order to get a good picture of what's going on. If you go to the next slide, this just simply shows you that we tried as much as possible to calibrate our results to historical data. As I mentioned, there's much more details of this in the larger report that I'll point you the link to. Let's go forward from this point after having explained sort of where we're coming from, the basic structure of the model, and and how it compares to the historical projections. And you'll see that, you may have noticed that you do catch up to aquaculture does catch up to capture at some point to 2030 actually by 2030 in our projections. So the projections to 2030, I'll just give you a very brief overview given the time that's available in terms of what we had projected in that regard. So China, in terms of fish consumption, has the greatest growth. It's still the biggest consumer by 2030, as it has been in the past. And you can see where the other regions line up. As was mentioned, Sub-Saharan Africa is not the smallest, but it certainly doesn't have as big growth as others. If you go to the next slide on total fish production, this is both capture and aquaculture. You can see also that China does have the biggest share of global production and growth over that period. With growth happening in Sub-Saharan Africa, as was mentioned previously, being very low. Egypt, which is where the Central West Asia, North Africa region is up near the top, that's where Egypt sits. And also give you some very specific Egypt results in just a little bit, just to give you a sense of where it fits into this overall perspective. But as I've already mentioned, as was already mentioned before, as you'll see on the next slide, all of that total fish production is coming from aquaculture. And so this third slide here gives you the projected growth in global aquaculture production broken out into these macro regions, showing you again that you have very dynamic sustained growth in places like China. Southeast Asia, though, which is where Thailand and others has pretty dynamic growth as well over this period. India showing actually quite a bit of growth. But as was mentioned previously, what we could project based on the information we had for Sub-Saharan Africa was very, very low growth, and continued very, very low in terms of total amounts and in terms of the growth over that period. And I think it's difficult, as I mentioned before, to capture the dynamics of structural change. And certainly in order for there to be a takeoff, and there certainly is potential for there to be a takeoff in Sub-Saharan African production, I think a whole foresight exercise could be done, and I think Fish sounds like they're doing that in terms of looking at where that breakthrough can happen, and so you'd probably get a very different perspective if you added in some of those possibilities to this picture. If you go to the next slide, since we're winding down soon, I just wanted to show you that in terms of technical efficiency, even that great growth that I showed you in aquaculture production is happening with more efficiency in terms of fish meal usage. So fish meal total production and usage in aquaculture has actually remained fairly stagnant, fairly stable. So it just means that as the industry has been evolving, and it's a relatively young industry compared to the rest of agriculture and livestock, it's been improving quite a bit in terms of efficiency of feeding, as well as management of diseases. I'm sure will come up later in the presentations. In the next slide, just to give you just briefly a look at where it fits in terms of the nutrition picture, and this is just protein availability, what's available in terms of per capita intake of animal source protein. The proportion coming from aquaculture can be anywhere from, at the top of the chart is Japan, 60%. Where Egypt sits is pretty much just above the 20% line there, about 23% according to our projections here. You can see that the share is stable or falling in a lot of regions. Where it is rising, it's for places like other South Asia, going up from slightly below 50 going up. You'll also see China rises in our projections from about 30% going up as well. Okay, just to show briefly then the next couple of slides, because I know I have to conclude right now, just to give you a perspective of where total fish production in Egypt, in our results, and I've divided it here between aquaculture and capture, and of course capture is a very stagnant proportion that you see. At the time we did this study, our latest data was 2008, so the 2014 projections are just about where, at least when I look on the statistics, Egypt should be for aquaculture production about 1.1 million metric tons. So we're not doing too badly for now, but at some point we're going to look back on the study and see how well we did, just like I did for the previous one. Just briefly on the next page, you can see if you break out what's happening in terms of production growth is coming from. You can see tilapia being the leader among that. As I said, we had to aggregate in some way. Some of these are fairly broad categories, but important things like tilapia we tried to bring out separately. And then the next slide on consumption results. This is more aggregated just because that's the way FAO presents their data. Tilapia would then fit within this fresh diadromous, which is this big one in the middle. Again, that's showing the biggest growth in consumption. But as you can see, that level of consumption growth exceeds the production. And so that means that Egypt would, at least according to our projections, would be in a net import position for some of those products. So just to conclude, in summary, as it will be shown, as will be talked about, I'm sure, later in the seminar, the fish sector depends on aquaculture to deliver what's going to happen in terms of future consumption growth. Incredibly dynamic. China still dominates. There still is very little in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's potential for future growth, and I think more work needs to be done in terms of doing foresight to see how that can happen and what institutional innovations, technological innovations can help that take off. But I think the story of this very young, very dynamic industry has been that of rapidly improving efficiencies and the spread of best practices from places like Norway and others for some of the higher value salmon, and as it has been propagated through global industries, as they learn how to do this industry better in terms of feed management and disease management as well. So thank you very much, and I will refer you to the IFPRI website if you want to look for the Fish to 2030. Actually, if you Google Fish to 2030, you'll find it on the World Bank website, FAO website, as well as ours. Thank you very much.
From Fish, I'm the director for Egypt and Nigeria. Well, I just want to understand from you. Basically, you've shown us that tilapia is a fish that is making Egypt shine out, for example. And I think some Asian countries as well have gone to that. But I know that there is also carp, which you mentioned, and we are also grappling with catfish being the second largest produced fish in Africa in terms of aquaculture. In your opinion, what is the species that Africa needs to develop so that we can see the Vision 2030 coming in, that we can all be able to have more fish by that time? Which species is this? Is it tilapia? Is it carp? Is it catfish? And probably just tell us why you think this is the case. Thank you very much.
One by one, or is there's another question I can collect and then answer both of them, or how do you prefer?
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, right?
Foresight for Africa specifically, my sense is that the non-carnivorous fish, of course, I think would be the best. Even though things like salmon, shrimp have a lot of market value, the fish meal problem, I think, is going to be the barrier. And I think, and again, I could probably do a lot more study just on the African issue, but my sense is that the feed issues that are preventing the livestock sector from taking off in a lot of places is also going to affect fish, the aquaculture sector, because it's a feed-intensive industry. And I think where you have good feed markets for livestock, I think the possibility opens up as well for aquaculture. So for catfish, the ones that you mentioned, catfish, tilapia, those can do very well with vegetable-based proteins. And I think I would say those ones would certainly be the top two on my list. And you'd have to probably go country specific to see sort of where the demand trends are. I've been doing a lot of recent work, not on fish, but on other issues. In West Africa, and I noticed that a lot of their production is still coming there. There's very heavy fish-based diets in places like Senegal, but they still mostly rely on capture right now for their consumption. So I think there could be possibilities of where fish can be integrated with maybe rice systems. For intensification. I know that's been tried out in Malawi. I know that's done quite a bit in places like Bangladesh and South Asia as well. So where there's possibilities for intensifying, perhaps cereal systems having aquaculture as part of that, where there's opportunities for that, I think that would be great. I mean, in the places where there's irrigation and availability of water to do things like rice intensively, I think maybe aquaculture can also be co-produced there. But once you deal with some of the technical issues in terms of having those together, but I think where it's done well, that that shows where there's some there's possibilities for that. But I think that's a good question. I think probably the work that World Fish is going to do in Africa will probably really go a long way towards pointing out where the technical barriers are that need to be overcome. But those are my